Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Picture Lincoln Cathedral in the 1960s, that towering Gothic masterpiece where medieval England tried its absolute hardest to impress God with flying buttresses and stonework so dramatic it could have been designed by an overstressed theatre kid with a chisel. Deep beneath this architectural marvel, archaeologists made a discovery that would puzzle experts for decades, a skeleton that just didn't belong. Everyone assumed he was a monk because, honestly, what else would a dead guy be doing under a medieval cathedral? Maybe some ancient yoga session gone wrong, but this skeleton was all wrong for monastic life. No robes, no sacred trinkets, no dramatic arms crossed in that classic holy resignation pose we see in medieval art. Instead, he looked less like Brother Gregory, and more like Steve, who got hopelessly lost on his way to Canterbury and never made it home. The burial itself screamed panic. He was face down in the earth, with the haphazard grace of someone hidden during a crisis, which in medieval England could mean anything from heresy charges to sneezing too close to the bishop during Mass. For centuries, people whispered about this mysterious figure. What terrible sin had he committed to deserve such an undignified resting place beneath sacred ground? Then science stepped in with its cold, analytical gaze, specifically isotope analysis, basically bone tea leaf reading for archaeologists. The results were shocking. This wasn't a local man at all. His bones told the story of a Scandinavian childhood, complete with a sturdy frame and worn knees that came from a lifetime of hard northern European living. When the wind blew through the cathedral crypt at night, you could almost hear the faint echo of longboat chants. This revelation changed everything. The mystery man wasn't a disgraced monk or a heretic, he was a pilgrim. A deeply devoted Scandinavian who had walked, all the way from northern Europe, probably hoping for a miracle, or at least to touch a decent relic. The journey would have been brutal, hundreds of miles on foot through medieval wilderness, surviving on salted fish and questionable bread, dodging bandits and wild animals, all for the chance to pray at an English holy site. Somewhere near Lincoln Cathedral, exhaustion finally claimed him. Whether from divine rapture, medieval shin splints, or simple starvation, we'll never know. But when he collapsed, the local clergy faced a dilemma. They couldn't just toss a foreign corpse into the street. That's terrible publicity for a holy site. But they also weren't about to roll out the sacred burial wine for a stranger who might not even speak English. So they compromised. A low-key hole in consecrated ground and a collective shrug. For centuries afterward, people assumed he'd done something disgraceful to earn his face-down grave. The truth. He just believed a little too hard and had absolutely no idea how much walking would be involved in medieval pilgrimage. The real mystery isn't how this devoted Scandinavian ended up in an English cathedral. It's how he survived that incredible journey on medieval travel rations and still didn't get canonized as a saint. Sometimes, the most extraordinary thing about medieval mysteries isn't the supernatural explanation, but the utterly human truth hiding underneath. The genetic match was undeniable. This parking lot vagrant was indeed Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England. He'd spent half a millennium sharing his eternal rest with oil stains, gum wrappers, and the daily indignity of Ford Fiestas parking directly over his ribcage. The discovery solved one of Britain's greatest royal mysteries while simultaneously providing tabloid headline writers with more pun material than they'd seen since Henry VIII's matrimonial adventures. But beneath the humour lies something genuinely haunting. Richard III was reburied with full royal honours in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, finally receiving the dignified funeral that had been denied him for over 5 centuries. The twisted spine, the battle wounds, the ignoble parking lot grave, all bore witness to how quickly power can crumble, and how completely history can forget even its kings. The real mystery isn't just where Richard III was buried, but how easily the most powerful people of their age can vanish into obscurity, reduced to whispered legends until science drags their truth back into the light. Sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't found in ancient tombs or mysterious caves. They're hiding beneath the most mundane places imaginable, waiting for someone bold enough to look. Chapter 2, Forbidden Knowledge Decoded, Segment 1. While medieval kings were losing themselves under parking lots, other mysteries were hiding in plain sight on library shelves across Europe. In 1912, a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich discovered what would become the most baffling medieval manuscript ever found. A text so bizarre it made scholars question everything they thought they knew about medieval learning. The Voynich Manuscript looked like the fevered dream of a medieval scholar who'd drunk too many herbal tonics and decided to invent an entire alphabet, plant taxonomy, and possibly a new religion involving naked women in bathtubs. Written in a completely unknown script and language, its 240 pages contained undecipherable writing, impossible star charts, nude figures floating in green pools, and botanical illustrations that made professors throw up their hands and declare, "Nope, not real plants." For decades, experts assumed it was an elaborate hoax, maybe a prank played on some gullible medieval nobleman with more gold than sense. Others insisted it was a lost language, the diary of an extremely eccentric wizard, or possibly instructions for medieval time travel. The manuscript sat in Yale's Beinecke Library, like a paper middle finger to academic understanding, defying every attempt at translation. But here's where modern technology crashed the medieval mystery party. Artificial intelligence and advanced linguistic analysis finally cracked portions of the code, not the whole thing, because that would rob us of too much fun, but enough to fundamentally change our understanding of what this document actually represents. The results were simultaneously disappointing and fascinating. The language appears to be a form of proto-Romance, an early offshoot of Latin that scholars never thought was extensively written down. Essentially, medieval slang like discovering someone had carved "lol" into a monastery wall in 1420. The decoded phrases revealed herbal remedies, women's health advice, and astrological observations. This wasn't a map to the Holy Grail or a wizard's spellbook. It was a 15th century wellness blog. Think Gwyneth Paltrow, but with parchment and a seriously eccentric illustration style. Chapter 2, Forbidden Knowledge Decoded. The decoded sections revealed something almost mundane in their humanity. Here were medieval recipes for treating women's ailments, astronomical charts for predicting favorable planting seasons, and herbal remedies that would make any modern naturopath weep with joy. The mysterious bathing women weren't engaging in occult rituals. They were illustrations for balneological treatments, medieval spa therapy if you will. Those impossible plants weren't alien flora, but stylized botanical drawings of actual herbs, rendered by an artist who clearly valued artistic interpretation over botanical accuracy. So the Voynich Manuscript wasn't a map to hidden treasure or a wizard's spellbook. It was essentially a 15th century lifestyle guide, complete with health tips, beauty treatments, and astronomical advice. Think of it as medieval Pinterest boards bound in vellum, created by someone who had very specific opinions about both herbal medicine and artistic flourishes. But this revelation only deepened the mystery in some ways. Who was this anonymous author with their dying dialect and encyclopedic knowledge of women's health? Why did they choose to write in a language that was already becoming obsolete? And most puzzling of all, why did they illustrate their wellness advice with such surreal, dreamlike imagery that it looked like the product of a psychedelic trip rather than medical instruction? The truth is that medieval medicine was often indistinguishable from what we'd now call alternative therapy. Astrological timing for treatments, herbal concoctions that bordered on magical thinking, and the belief that celestial alignments could influence human health were all standard practice. What makes the Voynich Manuscript unique isn't its content, but the fact that someone bothered to write it all down in such elaborate artistic detail using a language that was already slipping into obsolescence. Recent analysis suggests the manuscript might have been created by or for women, given its focus on gynecological health and birthing practices, topics often excluded from male-dominated medical texts. This would explain both its unusual perspective and its obscure language choice. Perhaps it was a private medical guide, designed to be passed down through generations of female healers who needed to keep their knowledge both preserved and protected. Now we shift from mysterious manuscripts to mysterious children. Somewhere in 12th century Suffolk, in a village called Woolpit, which sounds either charmingly rustic or like an aggressive sheep farming operation, 2 children appeared out of absolutely nowhere. And when I say appeared, I mean, they literally materialized with no parents, no explanation, and no social media announcement. But here's what made local chroniclers reach for their quills. These children were green. Not metaphorically green like inexperienced newcomers, but actually, botanically, chlorophyll-level green. According to medieval chroniclers, who never met a story they couldn't embellish, these children spoke no known language, wore strange clothes, and looked like they'd just escaped from a particularly vivid manuscript illumination. The villagers, doing their best medieval impression of a wellness check, tried feeding them bread and beans. The children refused everything except raw beans, because apparently they were both picky eaters and possibly engaging in some form of medieval photosynthesis. Eventually they started eating normal food, and wouldn't you know it, their green coloration began to fade like a temporary tattoo. Turns out, being green might have had less to do with alien genetics and more to do with severe dietary deficiencies. If you survive long enough on nothing but legumes, your body apparently decides to embrace the plant kingdom and hope for the best. The boy, sadly, died soon after. Not unusual in an era where eating a questionable mushroom could prove fatal, and not eating at all was equally dangerous. But the girl survived, learned English, and eventually revealed their origin story. They came from a place of eternal twilight with no sun, she claimed, and had been herding their father's cattle when they somehow wandered into Woolpit through a mysterious cave system. The modern explanation is far less mystical but equally tragic. They were likely Flemish refugee children, kids who had fled political violence and persecution, got lost in the dense forests surrounding Woolpit, and suffered severe malnutrition. The Flemish connection explains everything that had mystified medieval chroniclers. Their strange language would have been Dutch, or a Flemish dialect, completely foreign to English ears. Their unusual clothing reflected different regional styles, and their land of eternal twilight was probably the perpetually shaded interior of Thetford Forest, where refugees might have been hiding from royal persecution. The green skin that so fascinated medieval observers was most likely chlorosis, a condition caused by severe iron deficiency and malnutrition. When your diet consists mainly of whatever beans and roots you can scrounge from the forest floor, your body starts shutting down non-essential functions, and your skin can take on a distinctly greenish pallor. It's the medieval equivalent of looking like death warmed over, except the death part was uncomfortably literal. This explanation transforms the story from supernatural mystery to human tragedy. 2 Flemish children, probably siblings, had been separated from their family during one of the many violent upheavals of the 12th century. They survived in the wilderness for weeks or months, eating whatever they could find, growing weaker and more disoriented until they finally stumbled into Woolpit half dead from starvation. The villagers' initial fear makes perfect sense when you consider they were looking at 2 emaciated, green-tinged children who spoke gibberish and acted like feral forest creatures. But medieval hospitality eventually overcame medieval suspicion, and the children were taken in, fed, and gradually nursed back to health by Sir Richard de Calne and his household. The girl's recovery and integration into English society speaks to both medieval adaptability and the resilience of children. She learned English, lost her green coloration as her nutrition improved, and eventually married into local society. Her brother's death was tragically typical for the era, when survival often came down to simple biological lottery. But even with this rational explanation, something haunting lingers about the green children of Woolpit. Their story captures the medieval world's precarious balance between civilization and wilderness, between the known and the utterly foreign. In an age when travelling 50 miles could land you among people who spoke incomprehensible languages and followed completely different customs, the appearance of green-skinned children wasn't impossible. It was just Tuesday in medieval Europe. What makes their tale endure isn't its supernatural elements, but its very human core. 2 lost children, probably traumatized refugees, stumbled into a village and found people willing to help them despite their strange appearance and unintelligible speech. It's a story about medieval xenophobia and medieval compassion existing side by side, about how quickly the foreign and frightening can become familiar and beloved. The green children remind us that medieval people lived in a world where the extraordinary could emerge from the ordinary at any moment. where the line between miracle and misfortune was often determined by nothing more than who happened to find you first. Their story survives because it captures something essential about both medieval life and human nature. Sometimes the most mysterious things are the most heartbreakingly simple. Now, speaking of mysterious markings that had people reaching for supernatural explanations, let's examine what medieval churchgoers were actually scratching into their sacred walls while pretending to pay attention to Sunday sermons. Chapter 3. They were likely Flemish refugee children, kids who had fled political violence and persecution, got lost in the dense forests surrounding Woolpit, and suffered severe malnutrition. The Flemish connection explains everything that had mystified medieval chroniclers. Their strange language would have been Dutch or a Flemish dialect, completely foreign to English ears. Their unusual clothing reflected different regional styles, and their land of eternal twilight was probably the perpetually shaded interior of Thetford Forest, where refugees might have been hiding from royal persecution. The green skin that so fascinated medieval observers was most likely chlorosis, a condition caused by severe iron deficiency and malnutrition. When your diet consists mainly of whatever beans and roots you can scrounge from the forest floor, your body starts shutting down non-essential functions, and your skin can take on a distinctly greenish pallor. It's the medieval equivalent of looking like death warmed over, except the death part was uncomfortably literal. This explanation transforms the story from supernatural mystery to human tragedy. Two Flemish children, probably siblings, had been separated from their family during one of the many violent upheavals of the 12th century. They survived in the wilderness for weeks or months, eating whatever they could find, growing weaker and more disoriented until they finally stumbled into Woolpit half dead from starvation. The villagers' initial fear makes perfect sense when you consider they were looking at two emaciated, green-tinged children who spoke gibberish and acted like feral forest creatures. But medieval hospitality eventually overcame medieval suspicion, and the children were taken in, fed, and gradually nursed back to health by Sir Richard de Calne and his household. The girl's recovery and integration into English society speaks to both medieval adaptability and the resilience of children. She learned English, lost her green coloration as her nutrition improved, and eventually married into local society. Her brother's death was tragically typical for the era, when survival often came down to simple biological lottery. But even with this rational explanation, something haunting lingers about the green children of Woolpit. Their story captures the medieval world's precarious balance between civilization and wilderness, between the known and the utterly foreign. In an age when traveling 50 miles could land you among people who spoke incomprehensible languages and followed completely different customs, the appearance of green-skinned children wasn't impossible. It was just Tuesday in medieval Europe. What makes their tale endure isn't its supernatural elements, but its very human core. Two lost children, probably traumatized refugees, stumbled into a village and found people willing to help them despite their strange appearance and unintelligible speech. It's a story about medieval xenophobia and medieval compassion existing side by side, about how quickly the foreign and frightening can become familiar and beloved. The green children remind us that medieval people lived in a world where the extraordinary could emerge from the ordinary at any moment, where the line between miracle and misfortune was often determined by nothing more than who happened to find you first. Their story survives because it captures something essential about both medieval life and human nature. Sometimes the most mysterious things are the most heartbreakingly simple. Now, speaking of mysterious markings that had people reaching for supernatural explanations, let's examine what medieval churchgoers were actually scratching into their sacred walls while pretending to pay attention to Sunday sermons. Picture a quiet English church scene, candles flickering against ancient stone, Latin chants echoing through vaulted ceilings, and a priest mid-sermon, probably warning the congregation about eternal damnation or the grave spiritual dangers of eating cheese on Fridays. Meanwhile, somewhere in the wooden pews, a bored peasant teenager is etching a crude doodle of a sword fight directly into the church wall, either for posterity or possibly out of pure, vindictive boredom. For centuries, strange carvings scattered throughout English churches had scholars scratching their heads. And not just because the medieval benches were constructed from splintered oak designed to prevent comfortable sitting. These mysterious symbols were long believed to be protective marks against demons, elaborate witch traps, hex wards, and circles specifically designed to confuse evil spirits who had apparently failed basic geometry during their infernal education. Some of the markings certainly looked ominous enough to support these theories. Interlocking circles, 5-pointed stars, odd runic scratches, and yes, daisy wheels, because nothing says terrifying supernatural defense system, quite like a cheerful flower motif carved into sacred stonework. Victorian scholars got particularly excited about these discoveries, deciding that medieval people must have been constantly terrified of being dragged straight to hell by goat-hooved demons during Sunday Mass, which, to be completely fair, was probably more thrilling entertainment than most actual medieval sermons provided. But then came the academic spoilsports with their laser scanners, systematic documentation methods, and devastatingly rational explanations. After thoroughly cataloguing over 28,000 pieces of medieval church graffiti across England, modern archaeologists discovered something that completely upended centuries of supernatural theorizing. Most of these mysterious marks weren't demonic defenses at all. The reality was far more wonderfully mundane. Many were simply names, drawings of ships, sketched swords, doodled cats, and the medieval equivalent of Gerald was here, 3078. Some represented genuine votive symbols, personal requests for divine protection, or commemorations of completed prayers. Others were clearly the medieval version of carving your crush's initials into a school desk, except with considerably more religious context and sharper carving tools. While some symbols did retain hints of magical thinking, a few circles might indeed have been intended as hex-warding devices. The romantic Victorian notion that every single mark represented a desperate medieval attempt to trap Satan in an elaborate stone doodle turned out to be, well, optimistically dramatic at best. The location of these carvings tells the real story. Ship graffiti clusters around altars dedicated to St. Nicholas, patron saint of sailors, suggesting these were prayers for safe voyages or thanksgiving for successful returns. Names scratched near doorways marked personal devotions. Geometric patterns around windows and thresholds did serve protective functions, but more as folk magic integrated with Christian practice than as sophisticated supernatural security systems. What emerges from this research is a far more human picture of medieval church attendance. These weren't just solemn spaces for rigid religious observance, but living community centres where ordinary people felt comfortable enough to leave their personal marks. The graffiti reveals medieval parishioners as recognisably human, bored, hopeful, fearful, playful, and absolutely willing to deface church property when the sermon dragged on too long. The standardisation of symbols across all of medieval Europe suggests a shared visual language of folk belief that transcended local boundaries. The same protective marks found in northern English churches appear in southern European cathedrals, indicating either widespread cultural transmission or deeply rooted human responses to spiritual anxiety. So the next time you visit an ancient English church and spot scratched ship outlines, geometric patterns, or someone's name carved in jagged medieval lettering, remember, this isn't evidence of demonic infestation or supernatural warfare. Chapter 4. Lost cities rising. The medieval hydraulic engineers who designed Rungholt's defences understood their environment's dangers, but they couldn't predict the scale of climatic disruption that was reshaping northern European weather patterns. The city's sophisticated dike systems, advanced for their time, simply became obsolete as storm intensity increased beyond their design parameters. Modern climatology reveals that the medieval warm period was ending precisely as Rungholt reached its commercial peak. What had been a relatively stable coastal environment for generations suddenly became a battleground between rising seas and human engineering. The Grota Mandranka wasn't just bad weather, it was the climatic equivalent of bringing medieval siege engines to a gunpowder fight. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of a community that knew it was living on borrowed time. Recent excavations have uncovered emergency repairs to seawalls, hasty reinforcements to critical infrastructure, and what appears to be systematic evacuation of valuable goods from the most vulnerable areas. Rungholt's residents weren't surprised by their city's destruction. They were desperately trying to postpone it. The moral tales that grew up around Rungholt's destruction served a practical purpose beyond religious instruction. They warned other coastal communities about the dangers of overconfidence in the face of natural forces, while providing a psychologically manageable explanation for an essentially incomprehensible disaster. It's easier to blame divine wrath for the loss of an entire city than to accept that sometimes human engineering simply isn't enough against environmental catastrophe. What makes Rungholt's story particularly haunting is how modern it feels. A prosperous community built in a vulnerable location, protected by sophisticated but ultimately inadequate infrastructure, destroyed by climate change that overwhelmed human adaptation strategies. The medieval chroniclers who blamed divine judgment were grappling with the same uncomfortable truth we face today. Sometimes the environment wins regardless of human ingenuity or moral worthiness. From flooded cities, we turn to mysterious caves that captured imaginations for all the wrong reasons. Enter the Cainton Caves, a sandstone network beneath a Shropshire farmer's field that looks like the set designer for a medieval horror film got completely carried away with atmospheric lighting and dramatic stone carving. With narrow passages snaking through rock, low ceilings that would challenge anyone taller than a medieval peasant, and intricately carved pillars that seem to whisper secrets in the torchlight, it didn't take long for the internet to go full conspiracy theory mode. The caves have everything a good mystery needs. Religious symbolism, hidden chambers, and lighting so moody it could serve as Instagram backdrop for aspiring goths. Naturally, whispers began almost immediately. Knights Templar, secret rituals, holy relics, underground resistance movements, basically every medieval conspiracy theory except aliens, and honestly, that was probably suggested too. For years, rumours swirled that these caves had sheltered the Knights Templar after their dramatic fall from grace in the 14th century. Hidden underground, the story went, they continued performing forbidden rites, probably whispering Latin prayers while trying not to bump their helmets on the deliberately low stone ceilings. The dramatic lighting in every photograph didn't help dispel these theories. The place looked like it belonged in a Dan Brown novel, or at minimum, the world's most committed medieval reenactment society. But here's where recent archaeological research comes in to absolutely demolish everyone's Templar fantasies. The cave system is probably not medieval at all. Most evidence points to the structure being 19th century in origin, which means the Knights Templar were long gone by the time anyone started carving elaborate stone chambers for mysterious purposes. The archaeological analysis revealed that these ancient stones were arranged with deliberate precision, their alignment suggesting ritual astronomical purposes similar to other megalithic sites across Britain. Essentially, Neolithic people had an impressive obsession with large rocks and celestial navigation, probably because GPS wouldn't be invented for another 5,000 years and they needed some way to mark important seasonal transitions. But here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating. The whispering part wasn't entirely folklore. Acoustic tests conducted around the Whispering Knights discovered that sound behaves very strangely near these ancient stones. Their specific shape, positioning, and material composition create localized echo chambers that cause whispers to carry and bounce in completely unexpected directions. Someone speaking quietly on one side of the formation might be clearly audible to someone standing in a completely different location, while remaining inaudible to people standing directly between them. In a pre-scientific world where acoustic engineering was about as well understood as quantum physics, this naturally meant the stones were either cursed, inhabited by spirits, or actively gossiping about local scandals. The mysterious sound effects would have seemed like irrefutable proof that these ancient monuments possessed supernatural awareness, especially when combined with their imposing presence and obvious ancient origins. Modern acoustic analysis has revealed that the stone circle's builders may have deliberately engineered these sound effects. The positioning isn't accidental. The stones are arranged to create specific acoustic phenomena that would have enhanced ritual activities, amplified ceremonial chanting, or simply provided impressive supernatural theatre for important religious gatherings. It's prehistoric sound design, created by people who understood the psychological impact of mysterious acoustic effects thousands of years before anyone had scientific explanations for how sound waves interact with shaped stone surfaces. The Whispering Nights serve as proof that our Neolithic ancestors were remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of both astronomy and acoustic engineering. They were creating monuments that combined practical astronomical observation with psychological impact through carefully planned sound effects. These weren't primitive people randomly arranging rocks. They were engineers and architects who understood how to create lasting emotional impact through environmental manipulation. Today, visitors to the Whispering Nights still experience the uncanny acoustic effects that gave these stones their name. While we now understand the scientific principles involved, the experience remains genuinely unsettling. Standing among 5,000-year-old stones that seem to whisper and murmur mysteriously creates a direct connection to the ancient people who designed these effects, who wanted their descendants to feel exactly the awe and unease that modern visitors still experience. The stones continue their eternal lean, still appearing to share ancient secrets in hushed stone voices. Whether they're haunted remains a matter of personal belief, but acoustically suspicious? Absolutely. They represent human ingenuity that transcends historical categories, proving that the boundary between science and magic often depends entirely on your level of technological understanding. The Whispering Nights have been successfully creating mysterious atmospheric effects for 50 centuries, making them possibly the most enduring piece of experiential architecture ever constructed. From ancient acoustic engineering, we move to medieval mysteries of a much more biological nature, where the boundary between miracle and decomposition became a matter of eternal consequence. Chapter 5. Royal Blood and Boners. In medieval Europe, if your body refused to decompose properly after death, you had exactly two career options: saint or supernatural menace. There was no middle ground, no grey area for the moderately well-preserved. Either the local priest would declare you a holy miracle and start commissioning stained glass windows in your honor, or the community would decide you were a demonic threat and prepare for an emergency exhumation featuring wooden stakes and very nervous gravediggers. For centuries, tales circulated throughout medieval Europe of corpses that simply wouldn't cooperate with normal decomposition schedules. Monks, nobles, and even ordinary townspeople occasionally made headlines, parchment margins, for staying suspiciously intact long after they should have returned to dust. The living, naturally terrified of being haunted by well-preserved relatives, blamed the usual suspects: sorcery, demonic possession, vampirism, or just catastrophically bad spiritual vibes. One particularly strange case emerged from a small monastery in Eastern Europe, where a nun known for her quiet piety and aggressive averageness in life was buried during a harsh winter. When her remains needed to be relocated months later during routine cemetery reorganization, workers discovered her body completely intact. This triggered immediate whispers of sainthood, candlelight vigils, and at least one terrified kitchen assistant fainting directly onto the monastery flagstones. Fast forward to modern times, and science arrives at the party with its usual enthusiasm for ruining perfectly good supernatural mysteries. Researchers recently analyzed several remarkably preserved medieval corpses using advanced techniques including DNA sequencing, forensic chemistry, and the thrillingly technical process of systematic fungal sampling. What they discovered was far less mystical and significantly more microbiological than anyone had hoped. Under precisely the right environmental conditions, a human body can dehydrate rapidly rather than decompose normally, especially when buried in cold, dry crypts with excellent ventilation and lime-rich soil. This natural preservation process, sometimes called saponification when body fat converts into a waxy, soap-like substance, can occur without any supernatural intervention, divine blessing, or demonic curse. It's simply good old-fashioned physics, combined with favorable soil chemistry. Our mysteriously preserved nun had been buried during a particularly brutal winter in an especially airy stone crypt surrounded by lime-laden soil, essentially nature's walk-in freezer, combined with a medieval dehumidifier system. No demons, no miracles, no supernatural preservation techniques, just environmental conditions that happen to align perfectly for natural mummification. Modern chemical analysis revealed additional details that medieval observers would have found deeply disappointing. The nun's diet had consisted almost entirely of pickled fish and rye porridge, foods naturally high in preservatives that may have contributed to her post-mortem durability. So, not exactly the dietary habits of someone destined for canonization, but certainly the nutritional choices of someone accidentally preparing for natural embalming. The discovery highlights how easily the boundary between miracle and microbiology becomes blurred, especially in societies where leeches represented cutting-edge medical technology and the germ theory of disease wouldn't be discovered for several centuries. Medieval people were operating with limited scientific frameworks for understanding preservation, making supernatural explanations not just plausible, but practically inevitable. What makes these cases particularly poignant is how they reveal medieval communities' desperate need for both hope and control in the face of mortality. Declaring unusually preserved bodies to be saints provided comfort and meaning, while labeling them as supernatural threats offered at least the illusion that evil could be identified and eliminated. Both responses reflect fundamentally human attempts to impose order on the chaos of death and decomposition. The medieval preserved nun serves as a perfect example of how scientific analysis can simultaneously solve ancient mysteries while revealing the very human needs that created those mysteries in the first place. The story reminds us that medieval people lived in a world where the line between miracle and misfortune could be determined by environmental factors they couldn't possibly understand, where scientific ignorance made supernatural explanations not just reasonable but necessary for psychological survival. From preserved nuns to royal mysteries that remain tantalizingly close to resolution, we turn to perhaps the most famous unsolved murder case in English history. The Princes in the Tower represents a mystery so enduring it has inspired centuries of historical detective work, political propaganda, and at least a dozen different theories about who exactly decided that two young boys posed too much of a threat to medieval power structures. In the summer of 1483, two royal brothers, Edward V, aged 12, and Richard of Shrewsbury, aged 9, vanished from the Tower of London with the kind of permanent disappearance that suggests their babysitting arrangements had taken a dramatically sinister turn. They weren't the type to wander off exploring medieval London's tourist attractions. They were locked up for their own protection, while adult relatives engaged in the sort of family power struggle that makes modern inheritance disputes look like polite dinner conversation. Everyone had a favourite suspect in this royal murder mystery. Richard III, their charmingly hunchbacked uncle, topped most people's lists because he was the one who had confined them to the tower before mysteriously becoming king himself, which represents the kind of career advancement that raises uncomfortable questions. But then there was Henry VII, who defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth and married the prince's sister, conveniently uniting competing family claims while ensuring that any surviving royal nephews wouldn't be around to complicate his legitimacy. The case seemed permanently cold until 1674, when construction workers at the tower discovered a wooden box buried under a staircase. Inside were two small skeletons, suspiciously child-sized and conveniently unaccompanied by helpful identification tags or explanatory notes. Charles II, displaying the kind of decisive royal judgment that had made his family famous, declared these must be the missing princes and had them reburied in Westminster Abbey with full royal honours, treating them like lost luggage that had finally been claimed. But here's what makes this mystery particularly maddening. Those bones have never been definitively identified through modern scientific methods. No carbon dating to confirm their age, no DNA testing to establish royal lineage, just centuries of assumption based on convenient location and suspicious timing. Until very recently, the Church of England and the royal family had been extremely reluctant to authorise invasive testing on remains that might not yield the answers anyone wanted to hear. However, mounting pressure from historians, forensic scientists, and the general public has finally pushed authorities to consider DNA analysis. The technology now exists to compare these bones with known royal descendants, potentially settling a murder mystery that's older than most European cathedrals. For the first time in over 5 centuries, we're genuinely on the verge of a scientific resolution to one of history's most famous cold cases. The implications are staggering. If the bones prove to be the princes, we'll know they died as children and were buried in the tower, supporting the traditional murder narrative. If they're not, then the mystery deepens exponentially. Where are the real princes, and whose children have been receiving royal funeral honours for over 3 centuries. The delay in testing reflects the complex politics surrounding royal mysteries. DNA results could definitively implicate historical figures, vindicate others, or reveal that the entire traditional narrative is fundamentally wrong. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a cherished historical mystery is actually solve it. The Princes in the Tower represent the intersection of forensic science and political power, where modern technology finally offers the possibility of historical justice, but where the answers might be more complicated and unsettling than anyone anticipated. Chapter 6, Dance of Death. The tantalizing possibility of finally solving the Princes in the Tower mystery demonstrates how modern science can reach across centuries to deliver justice, or at least closure, even when political institutions prefer the safety of historical ambiguity to the potentially explosive clarity of DNA evidence. From royal children who may finally get their day in court to a medieval phenomenon that turned entire cities into unwilling dance floors, we encounter one of history's most bizarre and terrifying epidemics. Picture this scene. Strasbourg, Holy Roman Empire, 1508. A woman named Frau Troffea walks into the street and begins dancing. Not joyful festival dancing, not celebratory wedding dancing, not even the sort of regrettable dancing that follows too much wine and questionable life choices. She danced like her very existence depended on continuous movement, because according to terrified eyewitnesses, it genuinely might have. Within a week, dozens of people had joined her compulsive choreography. Within a month, contemporary reports claim up to 400 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets, unable to stop moving despite obvious physical distress. Some collapsed from sheer exhaustion, others suffered strokes and heart attacks, and in at least several documented cases, people literally danced themselves to death. Historians now call this the dancing plague of Strasbourg, which sounds like a rejected Eurovision entry title, but represents one of medieval Europe's most genuinely terrifying mass psychological events. The contemporary sources are surprisingly consistent in their horror. This wasn't a party that got out of hand or an elaborate medieval flash mob. People were dying from involuntary movement, their bodies betraying them in the most public and humiliating way possible. The authorities, faced with a medical emergency they couldn't possibly understand, did what seemed logical at the time. They hired musicians and built a stage. Because if people are dying from dancing, clearly what they need is better musical accompaniment and more professional choreographic support. This represents medieval crisis management at its most tragically misguided. The city council's reasoning was actually based on contemporary medical theory. They believed that letting the afflicted dance it out would purge whatever malignant humours or evil influences were causing the compulsive movement. Instead of helping, the additional music and encouragement likely worsened the situation, creating a feedback loop where social pressure and musical stimulation intensified whatever psychological or physiological processes were driving the epidemic. For centuries, people proposed increasingly wild explanations. Demonic possession remained popular because it required no medical understanding beyond Satan did it. Others blamed hot blood or corrupted bodily humours, which represented medieval medicine's approach to anything they couldn't explain. One theory even involved spider bites, which would certainly make anyone dance erratically, though probably not for weeks on end. Modern scholars have narrowed the likely causes to 2 primary explanations: mass psychogenic illness and ergot poisoning. Mass psychogenic illness, also known as group hysteria, typically occurs in communities experiencing extreme stress, and Strasbourg in 1518 had all the ingredients for collective psychological breakdown. Recent famine, ongoing plague outbreaks, political instability, and social unrest had wound the community tighter than a medieval lute string. These people desperately needed therapy, adequate nutrition, and basic social services, not a municipal dance marathon. The second theory involves ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain and produces alkaloids chemically similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and compulsive behavior, and it's the same substance often blamed for the Salem witch trials. If Strasbourg's bread supply had been contaminated with ergotized rye, the entire community might have been experiencing what amounts to an involuntary psychedelic experience. except instead of seeing colourful patterns, they felt an overwhelming compulsion to dance until they dropped. Recent analysis suggests the dancing plague probably resulted from a toxic combination of factors: severe social stress creating psychological vulnerability, possible ergot contamination affecting brain chemistry, religious fervour intensifying both individual and group responses, and municipal mismanagement that turned a medical crisis into a public spectacle. It represents medieval society's complete inability to understand or effectively respond to what was essentially a public health emergency involving both mental health and potential food safety issues. The dancing plague of Strasbourg stands as one of history's most vivid examples of how psychological, social, and possibly biological factors can combine to create mass behavioral phenomena that seem supernatural but have disturbingly rational explanations. The tragedy demonstrates medieval society's complete inability to distinguish between symptoms and causes, between crisis intervention and crisis escalation. What makes the dancing plague particularly haunting from a modern perspective is how it illustrates the devastating consequences of governmental incompetence during public health emergencies. The Strasbourg City Council's decision to provide musical accompaniment and encourage more dancing represents one of history's most spectacular examples of making a bad situation exponentially worse through misguided good intentions. Their reasoning wasn't entirely irrational by medieval medical standards. They genuinely believed that allowing people to dance it out would purge whatever malignant influences were causing the compulsion. The epidemic's resolution came only when authorities finally recognized that their approach was killing people and changed tactics completely. Instead of encouraging dancing, they began removing the afflicted from the city entirely, taking them to mountain shrines for prayer and spiritual intervention. The change in environment, combined with the removal of social pressure and musical stimulation, gradually allowed the psychological and physiological processes driving the epidemic to subside. Modern analysis of similar mass psychogenic events suggests the dancing plague required a perfect storm of contributing factors: severe social stress creating psychological vulnerability, shared cultural beliefs about supernatural punishment providing a framework for symptoms, ergot contamination possibly affecting brain chemistry, and municipal mismanagement that transformed a medical emergency into a deadly public spectacle that fed on itself. The most chilling aspect of the dancing plague is how modern it feels, despite its medieval setting. Replace ergot poisoning with social media algorithms, mass hysteria with viral misinformation, and municipal incompetence with contemporary political responses to public health crises, and the basic patterns remain disturbingly recognizable. People under extreme stress, influenced by shared cultural beliefs and possibly chemical factors, exhibiting bizarre collective behavior while authorities make decisions that worsen the crisis through fundamental misunderstanding of the underlying causes. From collective madness to individual tragedy, we now turn to one of medieval history's most remarkable figures, a teenage king who defied every expectation about disease, leadership, and human endurance. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem became known as the Leper King, but recent medical analysis suggests his story is far more complex and inspiring than the simple tragedy that legend has made it. When Baldwin was diagnosed with leprosy as a child, everyone assumed he would die quickly and quietly, preferably off stage with minimal disruption to the political succession plans that adults had made without consulting him. Instead, he became king at age 13, personally led armies into battle against Saladin, and ruled the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem for over a decade while suffering from what was supposedly a uniformly fatal and disfiguring disease. While contemporaries were busy dying from infected splinters and suspicious cheese, Baldwin was outsmarting one of history's greatest military strategists despite progressive physical disability. The question that has puzzled medical historians for centuries is, what exactly was wrong with Baldwin IV? Was he really suffering from the full-blown leprosy that medieval chroniclers described, complete with the progressive disfigurement and social isolation that made him a tragic figure of romantic literature? Or was his condition something else entirely, misdiagnosed by medieval medicine's enthusiastic embrace of dramatic worst-case scenarios? Recent medical analysis suggests Baldwin most likely had tuberculoid leprosy, a much milder form of Hansen's disease that primarily affects peripheral nerves and skin rather than causing the catastrophic facial and extremity destruction associated with the lepromatous form. Tuberculoid leprosy can cause significant nerve damage, muscle weakness, and gradual loss of sensation in hands and feet, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the horror movie aesthetic that most people associate with medieval leprosy. Chapter 7. Secrets of the Convent. There's also compelling evidence that Baldwin might have had an entirely different neurological condition that was simply misdiagnosed as leprosy by medieval physicians who had limited understanding of nerve disorders. Charcot-Marie tooth disease, a hereditary neurological condition, causes progressive muscle weakness, limb deformities, and loss of sensation in hands and feet. Symptoms that could easily be mistaken for leprosy in an era when medical diagnosis was more art than science. Contemporary accounts describe Baldwin as physically deteriorating but mentally sharp until his final days. He successfully fought battles, arranged complex diplomatic marriages, and personally appointed his own successor, all while being unable to hold a sword properly or mount a horse without assistance. This pattern of progressive physical disability combined with unimpaired cognitive function is more consistent with certain neurological disorders than with lepromatous leprosy. What ultimately killed Baldwin at age 24 was most likely complications from progressive nerve degeneration combined with secondary infections and medieval medicine's enthusiastic but misguided throw herbs at everything. He died managing a crumbling kingdom while his own body was systematically failing him. Frankly, a miracle of determination and political competence that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. Baldwin IV represents one of medieval history's most remarkable examples of leadership under impossible circumstances. Whether he suffered from tuberculoid leprosy, Charcot-Marie tooth disease, or some other neurological condition, he ruled effectively for over a decade while dealing with progressive physical disability that would challenge anyone in any era. His story isn't just about medical mystery, it's about human resilience and political skill, triumphing over biological catastrophe. The scientific analysis of Baldwin's condition reminds us how easily medieval medical terminology can mislead modern understanding. When medieval chroniclers used the term leprosy, they were describing any condition that caused disfiguring skin lesions, nerve damage, or progressive disability, regardless of the actual underlying pathology. Modern medical knowledge allows us to recognize that Baldwin's symptoms might represent several different conditions, all of which would have been lumped together under the same diagnostic umbrella. From royal disability to hidden scandal, we now uncover one of the most intimate medieval mysteries ever revealed by modern science. Somewhere in medieval Europe, archaeologists excavating a convent cemetery expected the usual collection of rosary beads, humble wooden crosses, and the occasional shoe buckle that had somehow survived centuries of burial. Instead, they discovered something that sent medieval historians into immediate speculation. Overdrive, a female skeleton buried in full religious habit, clearly identifiable as a nun whose grave contained not one skeleton but two hers, and that of a newborn infant nestled against her ribs like a final, desperate embrace. The discovery was medieval scandal archaeology at its most uncomfortable. Here was physical proof that someone had broken the most fundamental vow of monastic life, and not with any possibility of maintaining plausible deniability. A dead baby in a nun's grave doesn't leave much room for alternative explanations or creative theological interpretation. Naturally, this sent scholars spiraling into increasingly dramatic theories. Had she been the victim of assault by travelling knights? Was this evidence of a secret affair with the local priest? Had the cloistered garden been cultivating more than just apples and prayer herbs? Did medieval convents harbour more romantic intrigue than anyone had previously imagined? Enter modern DNA testing, the 21st century's most ruthlessly accurate confession booth. Genetic analysis confirmed what visual examination had already suggested. The infant was biologically her child. No more virgin birth theories, no mystical intervention explanations, no possibility that this was someone else's baby mysteriously buried with an innocent nun. This woman had very much broken her vow of chastity, and with results that couldn't be hidden or explained away. Now, to be historically fair, childbirth in medieval convents wasn't entirely unprecedented. Medieval records are absolutely packed with monastic scandals, most of which were carefully buried along with any inconvenient physical evidence. But finding actual skeletal remains, that's archaeological gold, the kind of discovery that makes historians simultaneously excited and deeply uncomfortable about what they might uncover next. The mystery then became determining what had actually happened to this woman and why she hadn't faced the standard medieval punishments for breaking monastic vows. Medieval ecclesiastical justice didn't typically involve understanding or forgiveness when it came to sexual scandals, especially in female religious communities where chastity was considered the most fundamental requirement for spiritual legitimacy. But the burial itself revealed more than any trial record ever could. She had been interred with full religious rites, suggesting that her community either forgave her transgression or, more likely, worked very hard to keep the entire situation extremely quiet. Medieval monastic communities were essentially self-governing, and it wasn't uncommon for them to handle embarrassing situations internally, especially when attracting attention from the local bishop or, heaven forbid, ecclesiastical authorities in Rome could result in investigations that nobody wanted. The question of the child's father remains tantalizingly unresolved. Was he a passing knight seeking hospitality? A local farmhand with access to convent grounds? Perhaps a particularly persuasive travelling merchant? Or even a fellow religious from a nearby monastery? The possibilities range from tragic to scandalous, to genuinely romantic, and the archaeological evidence simply cannot distinguish between consensual relationship and sexual coercion. Some forensic analysis suggests the possibility of rape or assault based on pelvic trauma found in the skeleton, though other experts argue this could simply reflect complications from childbirth in an era when obstetric care consisted primarily of prayers and hope. As with all medieval mysteries, the truth remains frustratingly ambiguous, complicated by the passage of time and the limitations of interpreting physical evidence without contemporary documentary support. What the DNA analysis definitively proves is something both scandalous and heartbreakingly human. A medieval nun gave birth in secret, died during or shortly after labour, and was quietly laid to rest with her infant, in arms, religious habit intact, dignity preserved by a community that chose compassion over condemnation. Centuries later, modern science pulled her secret back into the light, forcing contemporary scholars to confront the gap between medieval religious ideals and medieval human reality. The discovery reminds us that medieval religious communities were populated by real people with real human desires, fears, and failures, not the spiritually perfect figures that ecclesiastical propaganda wanted to present to the outside world. Behind every medieval convent's walls were women dealing with the same fundamental human experiences that transcend historical periods: love, loneliness, sexual desire, pregnancy, childbirth, death, and the complex relationships between personal choice and institutional pressure. Her story survives because DNA analysis refuses to respect the carefully maintained secrets of medieval religious life. A woman who lived and died trying to balance spiritual calling with human nature has become an inadvertent symbol of how scientific investigation can reveal the intensely personal struggles hidden beneath centuries of institutional silence. The medieval nun buried with her child represents countless other women whose stories were deliberately erased from official records but preserved in the archaeological evidence that modern science can finally read. Her grave speaks to the universal human experience of love, loss, shame, and the desperate hope that even our most carefully guarded secrets might someday be met with understanding rather than judgment. Chapter 8. Victorian Crime. Revolution from the hidden tragedies of medieval religious life, we now leap forward several centuries to witness the birth of modern criminal investigation. When people think of Victorian crime solving, the image that usually comes to mind is straight out of literature: a man in a bowler hat with coat collar turned up against the London fog, magnifying glass in hand, prowling the gaslit streets like some real-life Sherlock Holmes. But the reality of Victorian detective work was far more revolutionary and significantly more bureaucratic than fiction suggested. The Metropolitan Police Force was founded in 1829 by then Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, whose officers quickly became known as Bobbies in his honour. But it wasn't long before London's rapid growth into a metropolis of millions created criminal challenges that ordinary constables simply couldn't handle. Street-level peacekeeping was one thing, but the city was increasingly plagued by sophisticated jewel heists, elaborate fraud schemes, and brutal murders that required investigative skills far beyond what a nightstick and a lantern could provide. In 1842, Scotland Yard created a small detective branch consisting of just 8 plainclothes officers who were immediately viewed with deep suspicion by the Victorian public. To respectable society, detectives seemed almost as criminal as the people they pursued. They didn't wear uniforms. They skulked around in taverns gathering information, and they infiltrated criminal gangs by disguising themselves as common criminals. Newspapers sneered at them as government spies and untrustworthy slinkers who operated in moral shadow zones where the distinction between lawman and lawbreaker became uncomfortably blurred. Yet despite public distrust, when truly baffling crimes occurred, everyone instinctively turned to Scotland Yard's detective branch for answers. These early investigators had to prove their legitimacy by solving cases that conventional policing methods couldn't touch. They pursued master thieves who specialized in sophisticated safe-cracking techniques and high-value art theft, tracked down notorious confidants, men who preyed on the gullible with elaborate investment schemes, and even uncovered political conspiracies during an era when fears of European revolutionary movements kept authorities constantly on edge. The early detectives were essentially pioneers of professional investigative work in Britain, though their methods represented a fascinating mixture of street-smart intuition, careful observation, and slowly emerging scientific techniques. What made Scotland Yard's detective branch remarkable was its gradual transformation from a distrusted experimental unit into a symbol of authoritative competence in modern law enforcement. By the 1860s and 70s, Scotland Yard detectives were appearing in courtrooms with evidence that carried more legal weight than mere rumour or community gossip. Their investigations shaped public understanding of what professional detective work should look like: methodical, sharp-eyed, relentlessly logical, and completely unyielding in pursuit of truth. The Yard's reputation was permanently established through high-profile cases, like their pursuit of the Ratcliffe Highway murderers, who terrorized London by strangling victims in dark alleys, and their methodical hunt for elaborate confidants, men who impersonated members of the aristocracy to gain access to private banking information. Though they began their careers under a cloud of public suspicion, Scotland Yard detectives had become indispensable by the late Victorian era. They were no longer just men in plain clothes conducting unofficial investigations. They represented the very embodiment of a new age of scientific crime-solving, where systematic deduction and careful investigation mattered infinitely more than luck, chance, or community prejudice. The transformation of detective work from suspicious novelty to essential public service reflects broader Victorian confidence in the power of systematic investigation and rational analysis to solve even the most complex human problems. These early detectives established investigative principles and institutional practices that would influence law enforcement methodology well into the modern era. The establishment of professional detective work represented more than just an administrative reform. It marked the beginning of a scientific approach to criminal investigation that would fundamentally change how society understood and responded to crime. But while Scotland Yard was revolutionizing investigation techniques, an even more dramatic transformation was occurring in morgues across England, where doctors began treating corpses not as mere remains, but as libraries of evidence waiting to be read. In early Victorian England, murder investigations were often little more than educated guesswork combined with community gossip. A coroner might inspect a body quickly, listen to witness statements from people who may or may not have been sober at the time, and declare a cause of death that satisfied local prejudices rather than medical facts. But as the 19th century progressed, a quiet revolution began in autopsy rooms, where physicians started viewing the human body as a book of evidence that could tell more truth than any living witness. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. The dead could testify. Doctors began systematically cutting open stomachs to search for poison residue, analyzing bruise patterns to determine whether injuries were inflicted before or after death, and studying blood spatter patterns to reconstruct the final moments of violence. These weren't just gruesome rituals performed by morbidly curious medical men. They represented the birth of forensic science as a legitimate criminal investigation tool. Toxicology emerged as one of the most important breakthrough fields. Arsenic, popularly known as inheritance powder for its convenient availability and its popularity among would-be heirs looking to accelerate their inheritances, suddenly became detectable through chemical testing procedures. For the first time in human history, a murderer could be undone, not by confession, eyewitness testimony, or community suspicion, but by objective scientific analysis that couldn't be influenced by personal relationships or social prejudice. The Victorian public followed these scientific developments with a mixture of fascination and horror that bordered on obsession. Courtrooms buzzed with excitement when medical experts delivered their findings, brandishing glass vials and describing chemical reactions that revealed invisible poisons with the theatrical flair of stage magicians. Newspapers eagerly reported on such cases in sensational detail, turning scientific testimony into popular entertainment and transforming the grim business of dissection into everyday conversation topics. People suddenly realized that crimes once thought completely unsolvable could now be proven with evidence that simply could not lie, unlike human witnesses who might be mistaken, bribed, or motivated by personal grudges. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. Scientific analysis promised objective justice, while simultaneously suggesting that no murder could ever again be considered the perfect crime. But the new forensic methods weren't without significant controversy. Many Victorians remained deeply uncomfortable with the systematic desecration of human bodies, holding religious and superstitious fears about dissection that dated back centuries. Others questioned whether men in laboratory coats could really be more trustworthy than traditional eyewitness testimony, especially when expert witnesses sometimes contradicted each other in court, confusing juries and feeding public skepticism about scientific reliability. Despite resistance from traditional quarters, forensic autopsies gradually gained acceptance throughout Victorian society. By the latter half of the 19th century, they had become absolutely indispensable to criminal investigations, transforming inquests from community rituals of moral judgment into scientific stages where evidence spoke louder than rumour, prejudice, or social connections. The forensic autopsy gave Victorian detectives their most powerful investigative ally, proof drawn not from fallible human testimony, but from the silent, objective testimony of the dead themselves. Chapter 9. The Science of Identity. This transformation of criminal investigation from guesswork to scientific analysis paved the way for one of the most revolutionary developments in crime-solving history. For most of human history, proving someone's identity in a criminal case was an unreliable business built on shifting foundations of human memory and social recognition. Suspects could lie about their names, witnesses could forget faces or misremember details, and even photography, though emerging during the Victorian era, remained far from foolproof for identification purposes. A clever criminal could simply change his appearance, grow a beard, adopt a new accent, and vanish into the anonymous crowds of industrial cities. But in the late 19th century, a biological detail no larger than a fingertip was about to reshape the entire future of criminal identification. The science of fingerprinting emerged from careful observation of something humans had always possessed but never understood, the unique patterns of ridges on their fingertips that remained constant throughout their entire lives. The idea that fingerprints were unique wasn't entirely revolutionary. Ancient civilizations had noticed the distinctive patterns on fingers, and occasionally used thumbprints as personal seals on important documents. But it was Victorian scientific methodology that transformed casual observation into courtroom-quality proof. In the 1880s, Sir Francis Galton, who happened to be Charles Darwin's cousin, began studying fingerprints with the systematic rigour that characterised the best Victorian scientific investigation. Galton meticulously categorised the whorls, loops, and arches that made each fingerprint distinct from every other human being who had ever lived. His research wasn't merely academic curiosity. It laid the mathematical and statistical foundation for an identification system that could withstand legal scrutiny. Galton's studies demonstrated that the probability of two people sharing identical fingerprints was so astronomically low that it essentially approached impossibility, making fingerprints the perfect biological signature for individual identification. The first practical implementation of fingerprint identification came through Sir Edward Henry, who was serving as Inspector General of Police in Bengal when he developed a systematic classification method that allowed prints to be stored, compared, and retrieved efficiently. The Henry classification system wasn't just scientifically sound, it was bureaucratically practical, designed for use by police departments that needed to process thousands of criminal records without requiring advanced scientific training for every constable. When Scotland Yard adopted the Henry system in the 1890s, the implications were immediately revolutionary. Identity was no longer based on fallible human memory, inconsistent physical descriptions, or the luck of witnesses who might or might not recognize a suspect months later. Instead, identity became permanently etched in the biological ridges of human skin, creating an identification system that was simultaneously personal and objective, individual, and scientifically verifiable. The first major breakthrough that demonstrated fingerprinting's courtroom potential occurred in 1902, right at the end of the Victorian era, when a burglar named Harry Jackson was convicted based on a fingerprint he had carelessly left on freshly painted windowsill. The genetic match was undeniable, and more importantly, it required no confession, no eyewitness testimony, no community gossip, just scientific comparison between the print left at the crime scene and the official record held by police authorities. The newspapers hailed Jackson's conviction as the dawn of a new age where even the most careful criminals could be betrayed by their own skin. The cultural impact was enormous, particularly for Victorian society that had grown accustomed to uncertainty and ambiguity in criminal cases. Fingerprinting seemed almost magical in its precision, as if the human body itself carried an unshakable record of truth that no amount of deception or clever disguise could obscure. Yet fingerprinting also carried a chilling message that resonated throughout Victorian society. No matter how intelligent, careful, or well-prepared, no criminal could escape the forensic capabilities of modern police investigation. Fingerprinting represented the ultimate marriage of scientific precision with practical police work, creating a forensic tool that was simultaneously cutting-edge technology and bureaucratic efficiency. The implications extended far beyond individual criminal cases. Fingerprinting established the foundation for modern information-driven policing that would eventually evolve into comprehensive databases capable of linking crimes across geographic regions and decades of time. But fingerprinting was only one component of a broader Victorian revolution in criminal identification and record-keeping. Before the 19th century, catching repeat offenders relied almost entirely on human memory and local reputation. A village constable might remember a troublemaker by sight. Victims could attempt to describe thieves' physical features, but such methods were fatally unreliable when dealing with the anonymous urban populations of industrial cities, where clever criminals could reinvent themselves simply by travelling to the next town. The Victorians, characteristically obsessed with systematic cataloguing and scientific classification of everything from botanical specimens to social problems, naturally sought better methods for tracking criminal behaviour across time and geography. Two revolutionary tools emerged from this bureaucratic ambition: criminal photography and comprehensive record-keeping systems that would transform repeat offenders from anonymous threats into documented case studies. Photography was still relatively new technology in the mid-19th century, but police departments quickly recognized its investigative potential. By the 1860s, systematic mugshots were being taken in stations across Britain, creating stark, emotionless portraits designed not for artistic merit, but for identification accuracy. These photographs captured both front-facing and profile views, establishing standardized formats that would remain essentially unchanged well into the modern era. The cultural impact of criminal photography was immediate and controversial. Newspapers occasionally reprinted mugshots in sensational crime stories, much to the horror of respectable Victorian citizens who feared the proliferation of rogues galleries would somehow corrupt public morality. Nevertheless, the practical advantages were undeniable. A criminal's face could now be permanently preserved and compared regardless of disguises, facial hair changes, or the passage of time between offences. Photography alone wasn't sufficient for comprehensive identification, so Victorian authorities turned to anthropometry, a measurement system developed by French police officer Alphonse Bertillon. Bertillon argued that every human body contained unique, measurable characteristics, arm span, skull length, ear dimensions, foot size, and dozens of other physical features that could be recorded with scientific precision. By combining detailed body measurements with standardized photographs, police could theoretically identify any repeat offender with mathematical certainty. The Bertillon system spread to Britain, where Scotland Yard experimented enthusiastically with meticulous measurement protocols and systematic record maintenance. Though eventually superseded by fingerprinting, anthropometry represented the first genuine attempt to transform human physical characteristics into searchable data, foreshadowing modern biometric identification systems by nearly a century. The creation of comprehensive criminal records reflected Victorian society's broader faith in systematic documentation and institutional memory. Index cards and registers meticulously documented aliases, previous convictions, criminal associates, and behavior patterns, allowing detectives to trace suspects' histories across multiple jurisdictions and years of criminal activity. This transformed law enforcement from reactive response to proactive investigation, where officers could identify career criminals and predict behavioral patterns based on documented evidence rather than intuition or gossip. The implications were culturally profound, representing the first systematic attempt to study criminality as a measurable social phenomenon rather than simply responding to individual crimes as isolated incidents. Chapter 10: Poison and Justice. For Victorian society, criminal record-keeping represented more than administrative efficiency. It reflected a fundamental shift toward understanding crime as a systematic social phenomenon that could be studied, predicted, and prevented through careful documentation and analysis. To reformers, comprehensive records promised fairness and objectivity, replacing community gossip and personal prejudice with documented evidence. To critics, however, these systems hinted ominously at government surveillance and the gradual erosion of personal privacy that would only intensify in subsequent generations. By the end of the 19th century, criminal record-keeping had become an established institution throughout Britain. Armed with detailed files, standardized photographs, and increasingly sophisticated identification methods, Victorian detectives had constructed the foundation of modern information-driven policing, an early database of human criminal behavior that foreshadowed the comprehensive surveillance capabilities of the digital age. From systematic identification to systematic detection of humanity's oldest criminal tool, we turn to the Victorian era's most terrifying class of murder: poisoning. If one crime haunted Victorian nightmares above all others, it was the silent, invisible murder that could be delivered at the family dinner table by someone trusted and beloved. Unlike pistol shots or knife wounds, which announced themselves with blood and violence, poison was utterly invisible, completely silent, and often administered by people who shared victims' most intimate domestic spaces. Arsenic earned the grim nickname inheritance powder for its popularity among would-be heirs looking to accelerate their financial prospects, and its accessibility was truly frightening. Every chemist's shop sold arsenic as rat poison, wallpaper colouring, and various household preparations. It was tasteless, odourless, and produced symptoms that could easily be mistaken for common illnesses until the victim was far beyond medical help. In a society where life insurance policies were becoming increasingly common and family fortunes provided powerful motives for murder, poisoning represented the perfect crime for intelligent, patient, and fundamentally cold-blooded killers. The police desperately needed scientific allies in their fight against invisible murder, and chemistry answered their call with revolutionary detection methods. The turning point came in 1836 when English chemist James Marsh developed the first reliable method for detecting arsenic in human tissue, even weeks or months after death. For the first time in human history, prosecutors could present objective, scientifically verifiable evidence of poisoning, rather than relying on circumstantial tales of suspicious tea preparations or sudden, unexplained illnesses that might or might not indicate foul play. The Marsh test became famous throughout Britain after a series of sensational poisoning trials where jurors leaned forward with fascination as expert witnesses demonstrated how trace amounts of arsenic could be revealed through dramatic chemical reactions. The test turned laboratory analysis into courtroom theatre, transforming chemistry from academic pursuit into a powerful weapon of criminal justice. Victorian society quickly demanded more comprehensive toxicological capabilities. Other chemists developed techniques for detecting strychnine, cyanide, and opium derivatives, creating an entire scientific discipline devoted to identifying the chemical signatures of murder. Medical experts became indispensable allies to Scotland Yard detectives, and chemical analysis became a standard component of any suspicious death investigation. Murderers who had once relied on their cunning and the invisibility of their chosen weapon were suddenly betrayed by the scientific contents of victims' stomachs or sediment residue in teacups. The age of the perfect poison murder was rapidly ending, replaced by an era where chemistry could speak louder than alibis or social respectability. These scientific breakthroughs weren't without significant controversy, however. Defense lawyers quickly learned to attack forensic chemists as charlatans and unreliable witnesses, claiming their tests were fundamentally flawed or that their professional motives were compromised by financial relationships with prosecution teams. There was some legitimate basis for these concerns. Early toxicology remained imperfect, and mistakes occasionally sent innocent people to the gallows while guilty poisoners escaped through technical loopholes or contradictory expert testimony. Yet despite resistance from traditional legal quarters and the inherent limitations of pioneering forensic chemistry, public fascination with scientific crime-solving continued to grow throughout the Victorian era. The press delighted in publishing detailed accounts of chemical tests and laboratory procedures, transforming the traditionally grim business of murder investigation into popular entertainment that combined scientific education with sensational drama. The cultural impact of forensic toxicology extended far beyond individual criminal cases. Victorian society began to understand that the scientific method could be applied to criminal investigation with revolutionary results, establishing precedents for evidence-based prosecution that would eventually transform the entire legal system. The battle between poisoners and chemists represented a broader conflict between traditional criminal methods and emerging scientific capabilities that would ultimately reshape how society approached justice. The Marsh test, in particular, became a symbol of scientific triumph over criminal deception. James Marsh's development of reliable arsenic detection arose from personal frustration with a legal system that couldn't adequately process scientific evidence. In 1832, when Marsh was called to testify in a poisoning case involving John Boddle, who was accused of murdering his grandfather with arsenic-laced coffee, his chemical analysis clearly demonstrated the presence of poison. But by the time the yellow precipitate evidence reached the courtroom, it had deteriorated badly, and the jury remained unconvinced of its significance. John Boddle was acquitted, despite the scientific evidence, and later confessed to the murder. This failure of the justice system to properly utilize scientific testimony motivated Marsh to develop a more reliable, more dramatic, and more convincing test that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. His new method didn't just detect arsenic. It produced a permanent metallic mirror on glass that could be preserved indefinitely and presented to juries as undeniable physical proof of poisoning. The first major application of the Marsh test occurred in 1840 with the sensational Marie Lafarge case in France. Marie was accused of murdering her husband Charles by systematically adding arsenic to his food over several weeks. The prosecution's case depended entirely on forensic evidence. They had to prove not only that Charles had died from arsenic poisoning, but that Marie had been the one administering it through contaminated meals. The trial became a public spectacle, with renowned toxicologist Mathieu Aufila demonstrating the Marsh test for fascinated courtroom audiences. When arsenic was detected in Charles Lafarge's remains, using Marsh's revolutionary technique, Marie was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The case established forensic toxicology as legitimate scientific evidence and demonstrated that chemical analysis could successfully convict murderers even when traditional investigative methods failed. The psychological impact on potential poisoners was immediate and profound. The knowledge that arsenic could now be detected weeks or months after death, even in decomposed remains, fundamentally changed the risk-benefit analysis of poison murder. The perfect crime that had relied on arsenic's invisibility was no longer perfect. It was merely delayed until scientific analysis could reveal the truth. By the end of the 19th century, The combination of systematic detective work, forensic autopsy techniques, fingerprint identification, criminal photography, and toxicological analysis had created the foundation of modern scientific crime investigation. Victorian society had witnessed the transformation of criminal justice from a system based on witness testimony and community judgment to one increasingly dependent on objective, scientific evidence that could withstand rigorous legal scrutiny. The revolution in crime-solving reflected broader Victorian confidence in the power of systematic inquiry, careful observation, and scientific methodology to solve even the most complex human problems. These pioneering investigators and scientists established investigative principles that continue to influence law enforcement and forensic science well into the 21st century. And there we have it, fellow night owls and history enthusiasts. We'd journeyed through centuries of medieval mysteries that modern science has finally solved, from Scandinavian pilgrims buried face down in English cathedrals to dancing plagues that killed hundreds in the streets of Strasbourg. We've uncovered the truth behind green children, decoded ancient manuscripts, and watched Victorian detectives revolutionize criminal investigation with fingerprints and forensic science. These stories remind us that the past is never truly silent. It's just waiting for the right technology, the right questions, and the right investigators to bring its secrets back to light. Sometimes, the most extraordinary discoveries aren't found in legendary treasure vaults or mystical caves, but in parking lots, church walls, and forgotten laboratory notebooks. What fascinates me most about these solved mysteries is how they reveal that medieval people were fundamentally just like us, dealing with loss, scandal, disease, and the desperate human need to leave something meaningful behind. DNA analysis doesn't just solve historical puzzles, it connects us directly to people who lived and died centuries ago, whose stories were carefully buried but never truly forgotten. If you've enjoyed this journey through history's darkest corners, please consider subscribing to the Drowsy Historian and hitting that notification bell. Your support helps me continue bringing these forgotten stories back from the shadows, and I genuinely love hearing from you in the comments about which mysteries intrigue you most, or what historical topics you'd like me to explore next. I've got more medieval mysteries, Victorian scandals, and scientific revelations waiting in the archive, each one stranger and more compelling than the last. From plague doctors to royal conspiracies, from ancient technologies to forensic breakthroughs that changed everything we thought we knew about the past. Until next time, keep questioning the official stories, keep digging into the historical record, and remember, the truth is always more twisted than fiction. Sweet dreams, and may your curiosity never rest. This is the Drowsy Historian signing off. Sleep well, history lovers,